Welcome, dear viewers. I'm so grateful to have you here. May your heart always be filled with love, your days with happiness, and your nights with peace. May every dream you hold close come true, and may endless blessings follow you wherever you go. Thank you for watching and for being a part of this beautiful journey. Let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? I'd love to hear from you. Also tell me, what was your favorite moment in this story? Which part touched your heart the most? Drop it in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications so you never miss another heartfelt story. Your support means the world. Much love to all of you. The city was alive with shimmering lights, neon signs flickering against the darkness, their reflections stretching across rain-slicked streets. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, high-end perfumes, and the distant hum of car engines purring through the night. Towering skyscrapers framed the skyline, their glass facades mirroring the moon's silver glow. It was a city that never slept, a world of power, ambition, and secrets. And in the center of it all stood Alexander Knight, a man who had everything, yet felt nothing. As he stepped out of his sleek black limousine, his sharp jaw tightened, and his usually penetrating gaze was clouded by a rare vulnerability. Tonight, the whiskey in his veins burned hotter than the usual fire that drove him. He was a man who never lost control, yet here he was, his senses dulled, his mind drifting in a fog of intoxication. His company's annual gala had been nothing short of perfection. Expensive champagne flowed, powerful deals were sealed, and the city's elite had clinked glasses in his honor. But none of it mattered. The moment the celebration had ended, a familiar hollowness crept in, the kind that no amount of power, wealth, or influence could erase. Alexander Knight, the untouchable CEO, the man who had everything, felt completely alone. He ran a hand through his dark, slightly tousled hair as he walked toward the grand entrance of the Royal Astoria Hotel, the five-star establishment where he had booked the presidential suite for the night. His personal assistant, Ethan, rushed after him, concern written across his face. "Sir, let me help you to your room," Ethan said, lowering his voice so the hotel staff wouldn't hear. Alexander scoffed, pulling his tie loose. "I don't need help." His voice, though slightly slurred, still carried the commanding tone that had built his empire. Ethan hesitated. "At least let me call the driver." "I said I don't need help," Alexander repeated, sharper this time. His steel blue eyes darkened, a silent warning that the conversation was over. Ethan sighed in defeat and watched as his boss strode into the luxurious lobby, his powerful presence drawing eyes despite his slightly unsteady steps. The staff immediately recognized him, bowing slightly, but Alexander barely acknowledged them. His focus was singular. Get to the suite, forget the world. He stepped into the elevator, pressing the floor number without thinking, his head leaning against the cool metal wall as he exhaled deeply. When the doors slid open, he walked down the dimly lit corridor, his expensive shoes barely making a sound against the plush carpet. His vision blurred for a moment as he reached what he thought was his suite. He fumbled with the keycard, irritation flaring when the slot didn't light up on the first try. With a frustrated sigh, he tried again, and this time the door clicked open. Not bothering to turn on the lights, he stepped inside, his body heavy, his mind too foggy to question why the faint scent of jasmine lingered in the air. He didn't care. All he needed was sleep. Without a second thought, he removed his jacket, tossing it carelessly onto the floor, before staggering toward the massive king-sized bed. His body collapsed onto the mattress, sinking into its soft embrace as exhaustion pulled at him. His arms stretched across the bed, his fingers brushing against the cool silk sheets, and just as sleep threatened to take him under, he felt it. Something warm, something soft. His brows furrowed slightly, but the alcohol in his system was too strong to make sense of it. The faintest floral scent filled his senses, soothing and unfamiliar all at once. He barely had the strength to question it before darkness claimed him. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, golden rays slipping past the luxurious drapes, casting long streaks of light across the room. The warmth stirred Alexander awake, his body heavy with the lingering effects of alcohol. A dull throbbing pulsed against his temples as he let out a low groan, his fingers pressing against his forehead. His arm was still stretched across the bed, resting against something smooth and warm. His body tensed, his breath hitched. What the hell? Slowly, as if fearing what he would find, he turned his head, and the sight that met him stole the air from his lungs. A woman lay beside him. Not just any woman, a stranger. Her long, wavy hair cascaded over the pillow, strands catching the morning light in golden hues. Her face, delicate and serene, was framed by thick lashes that fluttered slightly as she stirred. The sheet had slipped just enough to reveal the smooth, bare skin of her shoulder, the soft curve of her form hidden beneath the silk covers. Alexander's heart slammed against his ribcage. Who was she? His mind raced, trying to piece together the night before, but his memories were a blur. He remembered whiskey, the gala, the car ride, but not her. His pulse thundered in his ears as panic surged through him. He never did this. He was a man who controlled every aspect of his life, who never let impulse rule over reason. The very idea that he could have slept with a woman and not remembered it, it was unthinkable. Before he could move, she stirred again, her breath a soft sigh against the silence of the room. And then, her eyes fluttered open, deep hazel, warm and mesmerizing, locked onto his. For a split second, time stopped. The world outside faded, the noise of reality nothing but a distant hum as their gazes clashed. A strange electric tension filled the air, and then realization dawned in her eyes. Her soft lips parted in shock, confusion flashing across her features as she took in the unfamiliar room, the expensive sheets, and most of all, the man lying beside her. A sharp inhale left her lips. Alexander braced himself, his own breath caught in his throat. One night, one mistake, and everything was about to change forever. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to freeze. Alexander Knight, a man feared in boardrooms and admired by millions, found himself utterly speechless. He had faced ruthless competitors, navigated impossible deals, and commanded empires without flinching. But now, lying in an unfamiliar bed with a breathtaking woman staring back at him, he felt something foreign, disorientation mixed with intrigue. She was stunning. Her wavy, dark chestnut hair spilled over the silk pillow, framing a face so delicately beautiful it made his chest tighten. Her skin glowed in the soft morning light, filtering through the curtains. Her full lips slightly parted in surprise, but it was her eyes, deep hazel pools filled with shock and confusion, that held him captive. There was something unspoken in them, something that made him feel like she was a mystery he suddenly needed to unravel. Then, like a storm breaking through still waters, reality hit her. She gasped, her body tensing as she gripped the bedsheet tightly and bolted upright. Her delicate fingers clutched the fabric against her chest, as if shielding herself from him. What are you doing in my room?" she stammered, her voice soft yet demanding, like a melody laced with panic. Alexander blinked, his foggy mind still catching up. "Your room?" His voice was hoarse from sleep, his body still heavy with the lingering effects of alcohol. She swallowed, her cheeks flushing a deep shade of red. "Yes, this is my suite. I checked in last night." For a second, Alexander just stared at her, his mind working through the haze of memories, or lack thereof. Then, like pieces of a broken puzzle falling into place, it clicked. His drunken state, the wrong door, the scent of jasmine that had felt oddly soothing. Damn it! His jaw tightened as he slowly sat up, the silk sheet slipping slightly down his sculpted chest. His movements were controlled, but inside, he was calculating, trying to gauge the situation. His steel blue eyes flickered over the room, luxurious, feminine, utterly unfamiliar. He had walked into the wrong room. His gaze returned to her, watching as she kept her grip on the blanket, her knuckles white. Was she scared? No, not scared. Wary, defensive. She wasn't screaming or accusing him of anything terrible, just rattled. He cleared his throat, rubbing his temple before muttering, He stopped, frowning. His mind was still blank. Had something happened between them? The thought sent a strange sensation through his chest. He was never reckless like this, never the type to lose control in such an intimate way. Had he touched her, kissed her, taken her? As if sensing the turmoil in his mind, she let out a breath and shook her head, looking away. Nothing happened, she muttered under her breath. You were too drunk to even stand properly. You just collapsed on the bed and fell asleep immediately. Something inside him unclenched. A strange mix of relief and disappointment washed over him, but he shoved it aside. Right. His voice was unreadable, though his mind was anything but still. She didn't lie, he could see that, and for some reason that truth mattered. His gaze traveled back to her face, watching the way she bit her lower lip nervously, how her chest rose and fell beneath the covers. She was stunning in a way that wasn't forced or practiced, natural, almost intoxicating. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low, commanding. She hesitated, her fingers gripping the sheets tighter. "Why should I tell you?" she challenged, raising an eyebrow. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He liked that. Most women melted under his presence. Not her. "Because I'd like to know the name of the woman whose bed I stole for the night." She exhaled sharply, almost as if she wanted to roll her eyes. But then after a moment she spoke. Celeste Monroe. Celeste. The name rolled through his mind like a forbidden melody, dangerous yet enticing. He let it settle on his tongue, tasting the weight of it. Celeste, he murmured, testing the way it felt in the air between them. She looked at him then, really looked, as if trying to decide whether he was a threat or just an unfortunate accident in her morning. There was something guarded in her gaze, something that told him she wasn't the type to trust easily, and for some reason that intrigued him even more. "Now that you're awake, you should leave," she said firmly, pulling the blanket higher up her chest. Alexander's smirk didn't falter. Most women would have clung to the opportunity to talk to him, but Celeste, she wanted him gone. And strangely, that made him want to stay, but he wasn't the type to push, not now. He shifted, the muscles in his back flexing as he reached for his shirt. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, unbothered by the situation, as if waking up in a stranger's bed was nothing unusual for him. He wasn't going to let her see that. For once, he was caught off guard. As he buttoned up his shirt, he stole one last glance at her. She was still clutching the blanket, her expression unreadable, but in her eyes, he saw something she was trying to hide. Was it curiosity? Or was it the same unexplainable pull he felt toward her? Whatever it was, Alexander knew one thing: this wasn't over. As he reached the door, he turned his head slightly and murmured, "We'll see each other again, Celeste." And with that, he walked out, leaving behind a woman who had just unknowingly turned his world upside down. Celeste Monroe sat frozen on her bed, long after Alexander Knight had walked out of her hotel room. Her fingers clutched the silky sheets, her heart still hammering against her ribcage, her mind tangled in the aftermath of what had just happened. The infamous CEO of Knight Enterprises, the man whose name graced headlines, whose face was plastered on business magazines, whose power was unmatched in the corporate world, had slept in her bed. Even if nothing had happened between them, the undeniable tension in his gaze, the way his deep, velvety voice had wrapped around her name like a caress, sent an unfamiliar shiver down her spine. He had been infuriatingly composed, utterly unaffected by waking up in a stranger's room, while she had felt like her entire world had tilted on its axis. Shaking her head, she muttered to herself, "Get a grip, Celeste. He's just a man." But her own words felt hollow. He wasn't just a man. He was dangerously handsome, impossibly charismatic, and carried an aura of dominance that was impossible to ignore. His steel-blue eyes had held something unreadable when he had looked at her, something that had made her pulse quicken against her will. He had walked out of her life just as quickly as he had stumbled into it. And yet, the memory of him lingered, unsettling her in ways she didn't understand. But this was just an accident, a mistake, a moment that would fade into nothing. She would never see him again. Or so she thought. That evening, Celeste arrived at Luna Bell, the upscale restaurant where she worked as a private event planner. The venue was booked for an elite corporate dinner, one of the many high-profile events she meticulously managed. She thrived in the world of exclusivity, crafting evenings of elegance and perfection for those who lived in privilege. Tonight was no different, except for the restless energy buzzing beneath her skin, the lingering echoes of the morning refusing to leave her mind. The guests were already arriving, stepping out of sleek black cars, draped in designer attire, their laughter blending with the soft symphony playing in the background. Everything was in order, just as it should be. But then, a commotion near the entrance pulled her attention, a shift in the air that sent an unexplainable chill down her spine. Curious, she turned her head, and her breath caught in her throat. Alexander. He strode into the restaurant with effortless power, exuding authority with every step. His tailored navy blue suit hugged his broad frame perfectly, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned just enough to hint at the chiseled torso beneath. He moved like a man accustomed to being the center of attention, his presence commanding every eye in the room. Several high-profile executives followed him, powerful men in their own right, yet he stood out like a king among them. Celeste's pulse quickened. What was he doing here? As if sensing her gaze, Alexander's piercing blue eyes locked onto hers from across the room. A slow, knowing smirk curved his lips, one that sent heat rushing to her cheeks. Damn it! Before she could slip away, he started toward her, his long strides eating up the distance between them with ease. People instinctively stepped aside as he approached, his aura magnetic, unshakable. She should have walked away, pretended not to see him, but her body remained rooted in place, betraying her. When he finally reached her, his presence was overwhelming, an intoxicating mix of confidence and intrigue. "Celeste," he said smoothly, his voice like dark velvet laced with amusement. "What a surprise!" She forced herself to meet his gaze without faltering. "I could say the same," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "What are you doing here?" His smirk deepened, sending an infuriating ripple of awareness through her. "Knight Enterprises is hosting this event," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "And you?" She straightened her posture, determined not to let his presence shake her. "I work here." Something flickered in his expression, sharp curiosity, something dangerously close to intrigue. "Interesting," he murmured, as if filing away the information for later. Celeste forced a polite smile. "If you'll excuse me, I have work to do." She turned to leave, desperate to put distance between them, but before she could take a single step, his voice stopped her in her tracks. "You've been on my mind all day." Her breath hitched, and she cursed her body for reacting. Slowly, she turned back to face him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That's not my problem," she said firmly, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. His deep chuckle sent a delicious shiver down her spine. "It is when I want to see you again." Celeste clenched her jaw. This man was trouble, dangerous in ways she didn't want to admit, in ways that made her want to run. And yet something about him kept pulling her in. She narrowed her eyes. "You barely know me," she countered. Alexander took a step closer, his scent, expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely him, wrapping around her like an intoxicating spell. "I'd like to change that." Her breath caught. He was too close, his presence wrapping around her like a heated promise, making her pulse race against her will. His confidence was unnerving, his intensity suffocating, and yet it was tempting. It was infuriating. Celeste willed herself to stay firm. "I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing, Mr. Knight." Something in his expression shifted, something almost serious, almost intrigued. "Who said this was a game?" For a moment neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with something potent, something neither of them could ignore. It was a silent battle of wills, a push and pull neither of them had asked for, but were both undeniably caught in. Celeste refused to be another name on his list, another fleeting distraction for a man who had the world at his feet. She finally broke the silence, stepping back with measured control. "Enjoy your event," she said, her voice even, masking the turmoil within. Then, without waiting for his response, she turned and walked away, leaving Alexander standing there, watching her retreat with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. But she knew deep down that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Celeste's heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked away, her heart pounding in a way she wasn't ready to acknowledge. She could still feel Alexander's gaze burning into her back, an undeniable heat lingering in the space between them, a force she had never encountered before. The weight of his attention was almost suffocating, pressing against her skin like an invisible touch, making it impossible to ignore the way his presence affected her. She had encountered powerful men before. Her job required her to be around them constantly. CEOs, investors, billionaires who moved through the world with an air of invincibility. But Alexander Knight, he was different, too intense, too alluring, too dangerous to her carefully built walls. There was something about him that made her feel unsteady, like standing too close to the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of the fall. Yet as much as she wanted to ignore the undeniable attraction between them, fate had other plans, refusing to let her escape the storm that was Alexander Knight. The evening unfolded in elegance, the kind of perfection she always ensured at her events. Waiters moved seamlessly between tables, serving gourmet meals on pristine white plates. Crystal glasses clinked, rich laughter filled the air, and the soft notes of a live jazz band wove a spell of sophistication over the crowd. Everything was running smoothly, just as she had planned. But no matter how much she busied herself with details, no matter how much she tried to focus on the logistics, she couldn't shake the awareness of Alexander's presence. He was a force in the room, seated at the head table among the city's elite, yet somehow he seemed untouchable, above it all. She knew she shouldn't look, but every time she glanced in his direction, she found his gaze already on her, intense, unwavering, burning with something she wasn't ready to name. And then came the moment she had been dreading. The host of the event took the microphone, his charming smile lighting up the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, as part of our evening, we invite everyone to the dance floor. And what's a celebration without our honored CEO leading the way?" A murmur of approval swept through the room, guests nodding in anticipation. Celeste felt her breath hitch in her throat as she watched Alexander rise to his feet. There was a quiet confidence in the way he moved, buttoning his suit jacket with a composed grace that only made him more irresistible. He was a man who belonged in the spotlight, who thrived under the weight of attention, but it was his next move that made Celeste freeze. Without hesitation, without even sparing a glance at the eager women around him, Alexander walked straight toward her. The air in the room seemed to thin, the background noise fading into a dull hum as his long, measured strides carried him closer. Celeste's fingers tightened around the clipboard she was holding, her heart pounding against her ribs. Every step he took felt deliberate, as if he had already decided something she had no say in. When he finally stopped in front of her, the tension between them crackled like a live wire. He extended his hand. "Dance with me." Her pulse roared in her ears. "Mr. Knight." "Alexander," he corrected smoothly, his voice deep, expectant. Celeste swallowed, feeling every pair of eyes in the room on them, waiting. If she refused, it would cause a scene, but accepting, that was even more dangerous. The last thing she wanted was to become the center of attention, to be linked to a man like him in any way. And yet, as she stared into those piercing blue eyes, something inside her betrayed her caution. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her hand in his. A smirk of satisfaction flickered across his lips, barely there but unmistakable, as he guided her onto the dance floor with effortless ease. The moment his hand settled on her waist, Celeste knew she was in trouble. Alexander moved with a confidence that was almost hypnotic, his grip firm yet gentle, his movements smooth and controlled. He led her as if they had danced together 1,000 times before, as if her body naturally fit against his. The world around them blurred, the murmurs of the crowd fading into the background. All that remained was the quiet rhythm of the music and the intoxicating warmth of his touch. "You keep running from me," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as they moved in perfect harmony. Celeste swallowed hard, refusing to let her body betray the effect he had on her. "I'm not running. I just have no interest in playing your game." He chuckled softly, the sound deep and rich, sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. "I don't play games, Celeste. When I want something, I go after it." Her heart slammed against her ribs at the quiet certainty in his voice. "And what is it that you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His dark gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment the world around them disappeared. The music, the people, the elegant setting, it all ceased to exist. "You." A sharp breath caught in her throat, her fingers unconsciously tightening around his shoulder. His confession wasn't loud, wasn't boastful. It was simple, raw, and dangerously honest. And that terrified her more than anything. Celeste had spent years guarding her heart, carefully constructing walls that no man had been able to breach. She knew the price of vulnerability, the pain of trusting the wrong person. She had promised herself she would never fall into the arms of a man who had the power to destroy her. And yet, Alexander was looking at her as if he had already decided she was his. She should push him away. She should remind herself that men like Alexander Knight didn't do forever, that he was a man who conquered, who took what he wanted and moved on without looking back, that getting involved with him could only lead to heartbreak. But as his fingers brushed against hers, as his gaze burned through every defense she had built, she realized something terrifying. She was already falling. Celeste could hardly breathe as Alexander's deep, commanding voice echoed in her ears. That single word, "you," was so simple, yet it held an intensity that sent a violent shiver down her spine, awakening something inside her she wasn't prepared to face. She had spent years keeping men like him at arm's length, powerful, dangerously charming, and capable of shattering every carefully guarded piece of her heart. She had learned the hard way that men like Alexander Knight didn't play by the rules. They took what they wanted, leaving destruction in their wake. And yet, as he held her close on the dance floor, his body warm and solid against hers, her resistance wavered, slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. The heat radiating from him was intoxicating, his presence suffocating, yet electrifying, making it impossible to think straight. Every nerve in her body was on high alert, her pulse roaring in her ears, drowning out the sound of music, the chatter of the guests, the very world around her. The music slowed, but Alexander didn't let go. His grip remained firm, his hand a steady weight against her waist, fingers pressing lightly against the silky fabric of her dress as if staking his claim. His eyes, dark and unreadable, bore into hers with an intensity that left her breathless, pinned beneath his unwavering gaze. "Celeste," he murmured, his voice laced with something dangerously tempting, something that made her knees weak. "Tell me to walk away, and I will." His words sent a jolt through her, piercing through the haze of emotions clouding her mind. This was it. This was her moment to stop whatever this was before it spiraled out of control. All she had to do was open her mouth, push him away, end this before it consumed her. But the words wouldn't come. She should have said it. She should have taken the chance to escape, to break free before she drowned in the intensity of him. But instead, she stood there, frozen, trapped between logic and the undeniable pull of the man before her, because deep down, she didn't want him to walk away. The realization struck her hard, knocking the breath from her lungs, leaving her vulnerable in a way she hadn't been in years. Alexander's smirk, once teasing and full of confidence, softened into something deeper, something more intense, more real. It wasn't just arrogance now. There was something in his eyes, something raw and unguarded, that sent a dangerous thrill through her veins. Slowly, deliberately, his fingers brushed against her cheek, tracing the soft curve before tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was fleeting, yet it lingered, burning into her skin like a brand. He was memorizing her, committing the feel of her to memory as if she were something precious, something worth holding on to. The thought was terrifying. "I don't chase women, Celeste," he murmured, his deep, velvety voice sending a delicious warmth through her body, curling around her like an intoxicating spell. "But for you, I might make an exception." His words, spoken so effortlessly, so unapologetically, sent another shiver racing down her spine. Her heart pounded violently, betraying her every attempt to remain indifferent. She shouldn't be falling for this. She shouldn't be letting herself sink into the illusion of his words, into the dangerous allure of what he was offering. But the way he looked at her, as if she was the only thing that mattered in the entire room, made it impossible to remember all the reasons why she should walk away. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, her lips parting in an attempt to say something, anything, to break the tension suffocating the space between them. But then his gaze dropped to her lips, and the air between them thickened, charged with something unspoken, something undeniable. It was a warning, a silent promise, a moment suspended in time where everything hung on a single thread of tension. She should have stepped back, should have put distance between them, but before she could make a choice, he kissed her. The world tilted. At first it was soft, testing, teasing, his lips barely brushing against hers as if giving her one last chance to pull away. But the second she gasped against his mouth, the second she didn't resist, he deepened the kiss, consuming her like a man starved. His hand slid up her back, fingers pressing into her spine, pulling her against him, eliminating every inch of space between them. The warmth of his body seeped into her skin, wrapping around her like a vice, holding her captive in a way that was both terrifying and intoxicating. She should have stopped this, should have fought against the undeniable pull between them. But the moment his tongue brushed against hers, sending a bolt of pure fire through her veins, she was lost. Desire coiled in her stomach, heat spreading like wildfire as she clung to his shoulders, letting herself drown in the taste of him. He tasted of expensive whiskey and something darker, something dangerous, something addicting. The way he kissed her, possessive yet controlled, demanding yet reverent, made her head spin, made her forget the warning screaming in the back of her mind. His fingers tangled in her hair, tilting her head, deepening the kiss even further, until all she could do was hold on to him, afraid that if she let go, she would shatter. The world around them no longer existed. There was no restaurant, no music, no guests. There was only him. Only the way his lips moved against hers, the way he tasted, the way his body pressed against hers in a way that left no doubt about how much he wanted her. When he finally pulled back, it wasn't immediate. He lingered, his lips brushing against hers one last time, as if reluctant to part, as if he wasn't quite ready to let go. His forehead rested against hers, his breath warm, heavy, his fingers still curled around the back of her neck, keeping her close. Celeste's eyes fluttered open, her body trembling, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could feel it. Her lips tingled, still swollen from his kiss, still burning with the memory of him. She should say something. She should push him away, should demand an explanation, should tell him this was a mistake. But she couldn't form a single coherent thought. Alexander's voice was husky when he finally spoke, his words low and certain. "This isn't over." And deep down, Celeste knew he was right. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. Celeste sat alone in her dimly lit apartment later that night, her body still humming with a tension she couldn't shake. Her fingers trembled as they traced her lips, her breath uneven as she fought against the memory that refused to fade. Alexander's kiss, burning, demanding, unforgettable. She could still feel the ghost of it, lingering like a brand against her skin, as if he had marked her with nothing more than a touch. A frustrated sigh escaped her lips, and she shook her head, forcing herself to breathe, to think clearly, to push away the dangerous pull he had over her. This wasn't supposed to happen. This couldn't happen. She had spent years keeping men like him at a distance, refusing to let anyone pass the walls she had built around herself. And Alexander Knight, he was the very definition of danger, powerful, intense, addictive, a man who took what he wanted and never let go, and yet when he had kissed her, she hadn't fought it. She hadn't pulled away. She had melted into him, let herself feel something she had no right to feel. She had let him consume her in a way that left her shaken, vulnerable. She should have stopped him. She should have resisted. But the truth was, the moment his lips touched hers, every ounce of logic had disappeared, and all that had remained was the fire between them, searing and undeniable. She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair, frustration curling deep in her stomach. This has to stop. It had to. She needed to put as much distance between them as possible before it got worse, before she lost herself completely in a man who could ruin her. The next morning, Celeste arrived at Lunabelle with a firm decision in her heart. She would pretend last night never happened. She would act as if that kiss had meant nothing. She would put Alexander Knight exactly where he belonged, in the past, out of her mind, out of her heart, out of her life. It was the only way to protect herself, the only way to stay in control. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The moment she stepped inside, her phone buzzed in her purse. She barely glanced at it at first, too focused on steadying herself, on making sure she was ready to face the day without falling apart. But when she finally looked down at the screen, her heart slammed against her ribs. "Alexander Knight, come to my office. Now!" Her pulse spiked. Number. No, 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 she couldn't do this. She wouldn't do this. She needed to stay away, needed to hold her ground, needed to prove to herself and to him that what happened last night was a mistake. She inhaled sharply, fingers tightening around her phone, ready to ignore the message, ready to pretend she never saw it. But then another text appeared. "Alexander Knight, if you don't come willingly, I'll come to you." Celeste's breath hitched. Damn him. Of course, he wouldn't let this go. Of course, he wouldn't give her the space she needed. Alexander Knight was a man who got what he wanted, and right now, she had no doubt that she was at the top of that list. A sharp frustration coiled in her stomach, battling against the heat that spread through her at the mere thought of him. He was impossible, stubborn, unrelenting, and yet she knew, deep down, that he was also right. He would come to her, he would hunt her down, and the last thing she needed was a scene. With a frustrated sigh, she grabbed her coat and headed out. Alexander's office was a stunning glass fortress perched at the very top of Knight Enterprises, offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. But Celeste barely noticed the view as she stormed inside, her heels clicking against the sleek marble floors, her resolve hardening with every step. She would not let him control this narrative. She would not let him think he had won. As soon as she entered, Alexander was there, leaning against his massive desk, exuding effortless power, his sharp suit molding perfectly to his broad frame. He looked utterly unbothered, completely at ease, as if he had been expecting her reaction, as if he knew she would come. "You don't get to order me around," she snapped, her arms crossing over her chest as she fought to keep her voice steady. Alexander arched a brow, his lips curving slightly, as if her defiance amused him. "You've been avoiding me." Celeste stiffened, hating how easily he saw through her. "I don't know what you're talking about." A smirk played at the edges of his mouth, dark and knowing. "Lying doesn't suit you, Celeste." Her stomach twisted. She hated this. Hated how effortlessly he could unravel her, how easily he could see through every mask she tried to wear. She had spent years perfecting the art of control, of keeping her emotions locked away where no one could reach them. But Alexander Knight was dangerous because he didn't just want to get past her defenses, he already had. "This can't happen," she said firmly, forcing steel into her voice. "Whatever this thing is between us, it's a mistake." For a long moment he didn't say anything. He simply watched her, his dark gaze unreadable, as if he was weighing her words, deciding how to respond. And then, slowly, he pushed off the desk, closing the distance between them in slow, deliberate steps. Celeste's breath caught as he stopped mere inches away, the air between them charged with something thick, something dangerous. "You call it a mistake," he murmured, his fingers brushing against her wrist, his touch igniting a shiver that traveled through her entire body. "But tell me, Celeste, did it feel like a mistake when I kissed you?" Her heart pounded violently against her ribs, her throat tightening. His fingers tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His touch was feather-light, yet it commanded her attention, made it impossible to look away. "Because for me," he said, his voice rough, sincere, raw, "it felt like something I don't want to walk away from." Her breath hitched, her body betraying her even as her mind screamed for her to run. The way he looked at her, like she was the only thing in his world, was too much, too intense, too real. She had spent so long protecting herself, building walls so high that no one could get in. But standing here with Alexander so close, his touch searing against her skin, his words melting into her very bones, she realized one terrifying truth. She wasn't sure she wanted him to walk away either, and that scared her more than anything else. Celeste's pulse thundered in her ears as Alexander's fingers traced the delicate line of her jaw, his touch both gentle and possessive, like he was memorizing every inch of her skin. She needed to stop this. She needed to pull away. Now. But she couldn't. She was caught in the storm of him, drowning in the intensity of his presence, his nearness stealing the breath from her lungs. His words echoed in her mind, low and rough, a confession she hadn't been prepared for. For me, it felt like something I don't want to walk away from. She swallowed hard, her body betraying her, her heart hammering against her ribs like it wanted to break free, to surrender, to give in. number. She couldn't let this happen. She had spent years building walls, protecting herself from men like Alexander, men who had the power to unravel her, to consume her. "This isn't right, Alexander," she forced out, her voice barely more than a whisper. But even to her own ears, it didn't sound convincing. His dark eyes flickered with something unreadable, something dangerous. "Says who?" Celeste stepped back, desperate for space, for oxygen, for clarity. She needed distance to think, to remember why she had to stay away from him. "I don't belong in your world," she said, her voice firmer this time, though her hands still trembled at her sides. Alexander's jaw tensed, his expression darkening. "And who decided that? You?" She turned away, dragging a shaky hand through her hair, trying to gather the shattered pieces of her resolve. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand." His voice softened, losing its usual sharpness, laced instead with something that sounded almost like pleading. Celeste clenched her fists at her sides, struggling against the emotions threatening to break free. "You're a billionaire CEO, Alexander. You're used to getting what you want, to people bending to your will, but I'm not a game, and I won't let myself get hurt." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. She didn't dare look at him, didn't dare let herself see whatever expression was on his face. If she did, she knew she would crumble. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Alexander took a step closer, the air shifting, crackling with an energy she couldn't ignore. "Do I look like I'm playing?" His voice was raw, edged with something dangerous, something that made her breath hitch, something that sent a shiver skittering down her spine. She turned to face him, and that was her mistake. Because the moment her eyes met his, she saw it, the hunger, the desire, the same fire that burned in her. Before she could stop it, before she could think, Alexander reached for her, his hands gripping her waist, pulling her against him with a force that sent a bolt of heat through her veins. Her breath caught in her throat, her pulse slamming wildly against her ribs, and then he kissed her. But this time, it wasn't gentle. It was fire. It was chaos. It was everything Celeste had been running from. His lips moved against hers with a desperate hunger, a fierce possessiveness, his grip tightening as if he was afraid she'd disappear. A small gasp slipped from her lips, and that was all the invitation Alexander needed. His fingers pressed deeper into her waist as he tilted her head, deepening the kiss, claiming her, possessing her in a way that sent her spiraling. Celeste felt her resistance crumble, piece by piece, her fingers tangling into his hair as she let herself fall into the storm of him. His taste was intoxicating, rich and dark, like expensive whiskey laced with sin. He kissed her like he had been starving, like he had been waiting for this moment for far too long. And God, so had she. Alexander groaned against her mouth, the sound vibrating through her, sending heat pooling in her stomach. He pressed her back against his desk, his hands roaming her waist, her back, pulling her closer, as if no amount of space between them was acceptable. Her heart pounded against her ribcage, her body caught in the firestorm of his touch, his kiss, the sheer intensity of him. Celeste broke away, gasping for air, her hands gripping the edges of the desk behind her as she fought to steady herself. "Alexander!" His forehead pressed against hers, his breath uneven, his fingers still wrapped around her waist, anchoring her to him. "Tell me you don't feel this," he murmured, his voice rough, filled with an emotion that sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She couldn't, because the truth was, she felt everything. She felt it in the way her body still trembled against his, in the way her lips still burned from his kiss, in the way her heart ached with something deep and terrifying and impossible to ignore. She felt it in every part of her, in every breath she took, in every desperate beat of her pulse. Alexander's fingers trailed down her arm, his touch leaving a scorching path in its wake. "Then stop running!" She swallowed hard, her throat tight, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. I don't know how. His smirk was pure sin, dark and knowing, filled with a promise that sent another shiver through her. Then let me show you. And just like that, Celeste knew. This man was going to ruin her, and she wasn't sure she wanted to stop him. Celeste knew she should leave, she should push him away, gather whatever strength she had left, and walk out of his office before this got worse, before she lost herself completely. But her body refused to move. Her feet frozen to the floor, her breath caught in her throat as the heat of Alexander's presence enveloped her. She felt the warmth of his breath against her skin, the way his strong hands held her as if she was something precious, something he couldn't bear to let go of. And then his lips brushed against her neck, soft, teasing, and yet devastatingly possessive. A shudder ran down her spine, her fingers curling into the fabric of his suit, as if to steady herself against the storm raging inside her. "You drive me insane, Celeste," he murmured, his voice low and edged with frustration, desire, need. His grip on her waist tightened ever so slightly, his body pressing against hers in a way that made her head spin. "You fight this, but tell me, do you really want me to stop?" Her heart pounded violently, her mind screaming at her to say yes, to step away, to put an end to this before it consumed her. But her body betrayed her, trembling beneath his touch, leaning into him despite every logical thought she tried to hold on to. I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her hands gripping his arms as if that could keep her grounded. Alexander pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his expression unreadable, yet filled with something so intense, so dangerously raw, it made her breath hitch. "Then let me help you decide," he murmured, his voice sending shivers down her spine. Before she could process what was happening, before she could find the strength to resist, his lips captured hers once more. Fierce, demanding, yet impossibly gentle, it was a kiss that burned away every doubt, every hesitation, every last ounce of resolve she had left. He kissed her like he was trying to prove something, like he was trying to show her what she was so desperately trying to deny. And damn it, it worked. Celeste melted into him, her body surrendering before her mind could catch up. Her fingers found the front of his shirt, grasping the fabric as if holding on for dear life, as if letting go would mean losing herself entirely. The way he kissed her, like she was the only thing that mattered in this moment, like nothing else in the world existed, made her chest tighten with emotions she wasn't ready to face. His lips moved against hers with a skill that left her breathless, his hands roaming up her back, pressing her closer until there was no space left between them. And then, as if reality suddenly slammed into her like a freight train, she pulled away, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, her lips tingling from the kiss. "I can't do this," she whispered, shaking her head as if that could clear the haze of desire clouding her thoughts. Alexander's jaw tensed, his breathing still uneven. "Why?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, something that told her he was barely holding himself back. Celeste took a shaky step away, hugging her arms around herself as if that could protect her from the way he made her feel. "Because you're dangerous to me, Alexander," she admitted, her voice unsteady. "You make me feel things I shouldn't." He exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable as he stepped toward her once more. This time his movements were slower, gentler, as if he was trying not to scare her away. He reached up, cupping her face in his hands, his thumbs grazing over her cheekbones with a tenderness that made her throat tighten. "And what if I want you to feel them?" he asked, his voice softer now, but no less intense. Celeste shut her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, trying to find the strength to say no, to walk away. But the warmth of his touch, the way his voice wrapped around her like a promise she wasn't sure she could resist, it was too much. "I don't want to be another name on your list," she finally forced out, her voice barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to make Alexander still. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then his fingers curled just slightly against her jaw, his grip firm but not forceful. "Damn it, Celeste," he said, his voice raw with something she couldn't quite name. "Do you think I do this with just anyone?" She opened her eyes, startled by the sheer emotion in his voice. "I don't chase women," he continued, his gaze dark, intense, unwavering. "I don't lose control. But you—" His hands slid down to her shoulders, his fingers curling slightly against the fabric of her dress. "You make me want to break all my rules." Her heart clenched painfully. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But could she trust herself around him? Could she trust that this wasn't just another game, another momentary thrill for him? Could she trust that she wouldn't be the one left broken in the end? "I need time," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But she knew he heard her. Alexander studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching hers as if trying to decipher the battle waging inside her. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "Then take it," he said, his voice firm, his expression unreadable. His fingers traced the curve of her jaw one last time, lingering there as if reluctant to let go. "But know this, I won't give up." A shiver ran through her at the certainty in his voice, at the promise laced within those words. And deep down, she knew there was no escaping him, no matter how hard she tried. That night, as Celeste lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body still humming from Alexander's touch, she tried to silence the thoughts racing through her mind. She tried to ignore the way her heart still pounded, the way her lips still tingled from his kiss, the way her skin still burned where he had touched her. She tried to convince herself that this was just a moment of weakness, that she could still pull away, that she could still protect herself. But the truth settled deep in her bones, undeniable and terrifying. She was falling for him, and there was no turning back. Celeste barely made it through the next day. Every second dragged by in a haze, her thoughts tangled in the memories of last night, the way Alexander had touched her, the way his voice had wrapped around her like a spell, the way his lips had claimed hers so fiercely that she could still feel the ghost of his kiss lingering on her skin. She had spent the night tossing and turning, trying desperately to erase the way his touch had branded her, but it was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him. Every time she tried to focus, she heard his voice, felt the heat of his breath against her ear. It was maddening, intoxicating, and terrifying all at once. She told herself she needed distance, that she needed to regain control before she lost herself completely. But fate had other plans. That evening, just as she was locking up Luna Bell, exhaustion settling deep in her bones, the soft hum of an approaching engine sent a shiver down her spine. She turned just in time to see a sleek black car pulling up to the curb, its polished exterior gleaming under the streetlights. Her heart stuttered in her chest as the door swung open, and there he was, Alexander Knight. Tall, commanding, effortlessly breathtaking in a dark suit that fit him like a second skin. His expression was unreadable, his sharp gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a rush of heat spiraling through her. Her fingers tightened around the keys in her hand. "What are you doing here?" A slow, knowing smirk curved his lips, making her pulse skyrocket. "Didn't I say I wouldn't give up?" His voice was smooth, rich, dangerously alluring. Celeste swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand her ground despite the way her legs threatened to give out beneath her. "Alexander, I told you, I need time." He took a step closer, the distance between them shrinking in an instant. "And I told you, I'm not letting you go that easily." His voice was low, filled with a quiet determination that sent shivers racing down her spine. Her breath hitched as he leaned in, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His lips brushed against the shell of her ear, his breath warm and teasing. "You can't just show up whenever you want," she whispered, her voice barely steady. Alexander chuckled, the sound deep and sinful. Can't I? Damn him. Her pulse went wild, her body betraying her resolve as his fingers ghosted over hers. It was such a simple touch, yet it sent a spark of electricity shooting straight through her veins. He wasn't playing fair. He never did. Come with me, he murmured, his voice like velvet, coaxing, tempting. Just for tonight. Celeste hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to say no, to turn around, lock the door, and put as much distance between them as possible before she lost herself in him, completely. But one look into his deep, smouldering eyes, and she was already lost. Without a word, she let him take her hand. Alexander didn't take her to a restaurant, a bar, or anywhere public. No, that wasn't his style. He took her to his penthouse. Celeste's breath hitched as she stepped inside. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering city, the endless expanse of lights stretching far beyond what her eyes could capture. The space was sleek, modern, exuding wealth and power in every carefully curated detail, but none of it compared to the man standing beside her. Alexander loosened his tie with slow, deliberate movements, his eyes never leaving hers. There was something different about him tonight, something darker, more intense. I wanted you here, he said, his voice like silk, smooth and dangerous. Her throat went dry. Why? His lips curled into a slow, knowing smile, the kind that sent her heart slamming against her ribs. Because I can't stop thinking about you. Celeste's breath caught. The way he said it, so simply, so unapologetically, sent a rush of warmth flooding through her chest. She should walk away. She should fight this. But then he stepped closer, his fingers tilting her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. The world outside that penthouse ceased to exist. It was just them. Tell me to stop, he whispered, his breath fanning against her lips. She parted her lips, ready to say the words, ready to end this before it went too far. But she couldn't, because the truth was, she didn't want him to stop. And then his lips crashed onto hers. Celeste gasped as he deepened the kiss, his hands sliding down her back, pulling her against him as if the space between them was unbearable. Every touch, every movement sent fire coursing through her veins, her body responding to him in ways she had no control over. She clung to him, her fingers tangling in his hair, her heart pounding so hard she swore he could hear it. Alexander groaned against her lips, his grip tightening as he lifted her effortlessly, carrying her through the dimly lit penthouse without breaking the kiss. The air between them was thick with something electric, something raw and unrestrained. Their kisses grew more urgent, more desperate, as if they had been starving for this moment, for each other. By the time he laid her down on the bed, Celeste knew. Tonight, there was no turning back. She was his, and nothing would ever be the same again. The soft glow of dawn filtered through the sheer curtains, casting golden streaks across the luxurious bedroom. The world outside was still hushed, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of morning, but inside this room, Celeste's world felt anything but calm. Her body stirred beneath the crisp silk sheets, the remnants of last night still imprinted on her skin, in her mind, in the way her heart still raced at the mere thought of him. The air was thick with the scent of him, masculine, intoxicating, dangerous in the way it wrapped around her, refusing to let her forget where she was and who she had been with. A strong, warm arm tightened around her waist, pulling her backward against a solid, familiar chest, and Celeste's breath hitched as heat coiled deep within her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. She felt him everywhere, his touch still lingering, his presence overwhelming, his dominance imprinted into every inch of her skin. Alexander. The realization sent a shiver through her, and she wasn't sure if it was fear or something far more dangerous, something that made her want to sink into the warmth of his embrace and never leave. She had surrendered to him, given in to the fire between them, and now As she lay in his bed, tangled in his sheets, tangled in him, she had no idea what to do. Her heart pounded wildly as she turned slightly, her gaze landing on the man beside her. Alexander lay on his side, his dark eyes already on her, watching her with an intensity so raw, so possessive, that it sent another wave of heat rushing through her. He wasn't just looking at her, he was claiming her with his gaze alone, as if daring her to pretend last night hadn't changed everything. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice deep, husky from sleep, laced with something sinful. Celeste swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "Morning." A slow smirk curled at his lips, and God, it was devastating. "You're blushing." Her face burned instantly, and she turned away, flustered. "I am not." But Alexander wasn't having it. He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering against her cheek, setting her skin on fire. "Last night was real, Celeste," he said, his voice a mixture of tenderness and certainty. "And I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen." Her breath hitched. She had spent the night in his arms, lost in his touch, drowning in the way he had worshipped her, cherished her, devoured her as if she was the only woman in the world. And in those stolen moments, she had let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was. But now, in the soft light of morning, reality was creeping in. She couldn't be another fleeting moment in his life. She had told herself she wouldn't fall for him, that she couldn't fall for him, but she already had, and it terrified her. "I don't know what this means," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alexander propped himself up on one elbow, his sharp gaze never leaving hers, his expression unreadable. "It means I don't want to let you go." Her heart clenched painfully. "Alexander." He silenced her with a kiss. It was slow, deep, devastatingly tender, making her forget every doubt, every hesitation. His lips moved against hers as if he was making a promise he had no intention of breaking. Celeste melted into him, her fingers curling against his bare chest, her heart hammering in her chest. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against hers, his breath mingling with hers. "Stay with me." Celeste's eyes fluttered shut. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to believe this could work, that she could be with him without falling apart, without losing herself completely. But love was never that simple. And when it came to Alexander Knight, nothing would ever be simple. Later that morning, as Celeste slipped out of bed, the warmth of Alexander's body still lingering on her skin, she felt the weight of his gaze following her every movement. She could feel him watching her, studying her, waiting for her to change her mind. She reached for her dress, the fabric cool against her fingers as she pulled it over her head. "You're leaving?" His voice was calm, composed. But there was something dangerous beneath it, something that sent a shiver down her spine. She turned to him, forcing a small smile. "I have to open the shop." Alexander swung his legs over the bed, his movements unhurried, powerful. He was still bare-chested, the remnants of their passion marked faintly against his skin, a reminder of how completely she had given herself to him last night. He looked every bit the man who was used to getting what he wanted, and right now, he wanted her. "I'll have someone cover for you," he said smoothly, as if that was a reasonable solution. Celeste raised an eyebrow, folding her arms. "Are you always this bossy?" He smirked, his eyes dark with amusement. "Only when it comes to you." A flush crept up her neck. God, he was impossible. "I can't just disappear from my life, Alexander." Her voice was firm, though she doubted he would accept it without a fight. His expression darkened slightly, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stood, stepping closer until he was right in front of her, his fingers trailing lazily down her arm, sending tiny sparks of electricity through her veins. "Then have dinner with me tonight." Celeste hesitated. One night had changed everything. Could she handle another? Could she keep pretending she wasn't completely falling? Celeste stared at her reflection in the mirror, smoothing the soft fabric of her dress with trembling fingers. The deep, emerald green gown hugged her curves perfectly, the delicate material cascading down her frame in waves of elegance. Tonight was supposed to be a simple dinner with Alexander, just another evening together, but nothing felt simple anymore. Not after last night, not after the way he had held her, kissed her, whispered her name, like it was the only one he wanted to say for the rest of his life. She was falling, hard, and it terrified her. Alexander was unlike anyone she had ever known, intense, possessive, devastatingly charming. He made her feel things she had never allowed herself to feel before, made her crave things she had spent years convincing herself she didn't need. But this wasn't just desire anymore. It was more. So much more, and that scared her more than anything else. A sharp knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Celeste, your ride is here," her co-worker called from the front of the shop. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before grabbing her purse and making her way outside. The crisp evening air did little to cool the warmth spreading through her as she caught sight of the sleek black car waiting at the curb. It was a familiar sight now, Alexander's world woven seamlessly into hers in ways she hadn't expected. But when the driver opened the door, her heart stopped. Alexander was inside, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his dark hair styled effortlessly. He exuded power and control. But the moment their eyes met, something in his expression softened, as if for her alone. "You're stunning," he murmured, his voice rich and smooth, as his fingers reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Celeste felt heat rush to her cheeks at the simple yet intimate gesture. "You're not so bad yourself." A slow, knowing smirk played at his lips as he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping into a teasing murmur. "Careful, Celeste, you're dangerously close to flirting with me." She rolled her eyes, her pulse still unsteady from his closeness. "And what if I am?" Alexander chuckled, the sound deep and intoxicating, but there was something more in his gaze tonight, something that sent a shiver down her spine. "Then I might have to steal you away for the rest of the night," he whispered, his voice like a promise and a warning all at once. Celeste's breath hitched, but before she could respond, the car slowed, pulling to a stop in front of an elegant rooftop restaurant. The entire place exuded exclusivity, the kind of luxury most people only dreamed of experiencing. As they stepped inside, candlelight flickered softly across the intimate dining space, casting golden hues over polished tables draped in white linens. The atmosphere was warm, yet sophisticated, filled with quiet murmurs of conversation and the soft clinking of glasses. But for Celeste, none of it mattered. The only thing she noticed was him. The way he pulled out her chair, the way his fingers brushed over hers as he handed her a glass of wine, the way his gaze never strayed from her, as if she was the only thing in the world that held his interest. The evening passed in a blur of teasing smiles, stolen touches, and lingering gazes. Celeste found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, completely enraptured by the way Alexander effortlessly made her forget the world outside this moment. He listened to her, truly listened, as if every word she spoke mattered. She wanted to believe this was real, that it wasn't just a fleeting moment in Alexander Knight's world, that maybe, just maybe, she could be something more than just another passing affair. But just as she was beginning to let herself believe in the possibility of love, the past came crashing back. As they stepped out of the restaurant, hand in hand, a voice cut through the crisp night air like a knife. "Well, well, if it isn't the untouchable Alexander Knight." Celeste stiffened at the cold amusement in the man's voice, an unsettling chill creeping up her spine. Beside her, she felt Alexander's entire body tense, his grip on her hand tightening, as he turned toward the voice. Standing by the valet was a man with sharp blue eyes, a confident smirk etched across his face. He was tall, dressed in an expensive suit, exuding the same air of wealth and power as Alexander, but with an unmistakable edge of arrogance. Celeste didn't recognize him, but from the way Alexander's jaw clenched, from the way his entire posture shifted into something rigid and controlled, she knew this was someone from his past. "Tristan," Alexander said, his voice dangerously calm. Tristan's gaze flickered to Celeste, his smirk widening with something almost predatory. "And who's this? A new plaything?" Celeste's stomach twisted at the cruel words, a sharp pang of unease settling in her chest. Before she could react, Alexander stepped forward, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. "You don't get to speak about her," he bit out, his voice low and threatening. Tristan let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. "Relax, old friend. I was just making conversation." His eyes gleamed with something dark, something unreadable. "Though I have to say, I'm surprised. You never cared about anyone before." He paused, letting the words hang heavily in the air before adding, "Does she know?" Alexander's entire body went rigid, his grip on Celeste tightening almost imperceptibly. Celeste felt the blood drain from her face. "Know what?" She turned to Alexander, her heart pounding. "Alexander, what is he talking about?" Silence stretched between them. For the first time since she had met him, Alexander looked afraid. His usual confidence, his unwavering control, it was slipping. And in that moment Celeste knew, whatever this was, whatever secret he was keeping, it had the power to change everything. The air between them thickened with a tension so heavy it felt suffocating. Just moments ago, the night had been filled with soft laughter, stolen touches, and the intoxicating warmth of Alexander's presence. But now, that warmth had vanished, replaced by something darker, something unspoken, yet clawing its way to the surface. Celeste's fingers trembled in Alexander's grip, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing, replaying Tristan's words over and over again, each syllable slicing through her fragile trust like a blade. She searched Alexander's face, desperate for an answer, for a reassurance that Tristan was lying, that there was no terrible truth lurking behind those piercing eyes. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what is he talking about?" Tristan's smirk widened as if savoring every second of Alexander's discomfort. His eyes gleamed with cruel amusement, his posture relaxed as though he had already won. "Come on, Knight, tell her the truth," he taunted. Alexander's jaw clenched so tightly that the sharp angles of his face looked even more pronounced under the dim streetlights. His grip on Celeste's hand tightened briefly before he abruptly let go, as if letting go of more than just her fingers, as if letting go of the fragile moment between them. His entire body was rigid, his breaths slow and measured, as if he were forcing himself to stay calm. "Stay out of this, Tristan," he said, his voice dangerously cold. Tristan gave a mock sigh, crossing his arms. "You really think she won't find out eventually? Poor thing, looks like she actually trusts you." He tilted his head slightly, watching Celeste with an almost pitying expression. "What's worse, she wants to trust you." Celeste's heart pounded violently against her ribcage. Trust. Wasn't that what she had been allowing herself to feel for Alexander? Wasn't that what she had been fighting against, but finally starting to surrender to? But now, doubt slithered in like a poison, twisting its way around her thoughts, suffocating the certainty she had begun to build. Her voice came out quieter this time, more fragile, more afraid. "Alexander, please, just tell me the truth." For the first time since she had met him, he looked hesitant, vulnerable. as if the carefully constructed armor he wore was beginning to crack, revealing something underneath that he wasn't ready to show. Tristan scoffed, shaking his head in amusement. "Fine. If you won't say it, I'll do it for you." He turned his full attention to Celeste, his smirk deepening as if he lived for moments like this, moments of destruction, of chaos. "Your precious Alexander Knight isn't as noble as he pretends to be. Did he tell you how he built his empire?" Celeste frowned, her breath catching. "What do you mean?" Tristan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make the moment more dramatic. "Alexander ruined a family, Celeste. He destroyed a company, crushed people beneath his feet, took everything from them, and he did it without hesitation." Her stomach twisted painfully. Her mind screamed at her to look at Alexander, to see his reaction, to search for denial in his expression. But she was almost too afraid to do it, almost too afraid to find out the truth. But she forced herself to turn toward him, and her heart dropped, because Alexander said nothing. He didn't argue, he didn't deny it, he didn't push back against the accusation with the kind of sharp, unwavering confidence he always had. He was silent, and that silence was deafening. Celeste felt a cold numbness settle in her bones, her pulse slowing to something painful. She took a step back, creating distance between them, suddenly needing space, suddenly needing air. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander's fists clenched at his sides, his expression unreadable. "It's complicated." Her chest tightened and her throat burned. That wasn't a no. Tristan chuckled darkly, shaking his head as if he had expected this outcome all along. "See? He won't even deny it." He patted Alexander on the shoulder mockingly, his smirk still firmly in place. "Anyway, I just wanted to drop by and remind you that karma has a way of catching up to people." With one last glance at Celeste, Tristan turned on his heel and disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the ghost of his words, the damage already done. Celeste felt frozen in place. Everything felt different now, the world slightly tilted, as if she had stepped into an alternate reality where she didn't truly know the man standing in front of her. She turned back to Alexander, her chest aching with something she couldn't quite name. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice barely steady. Alexander exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his entire body tense. "Celeste, I never wanted you to find out like this." Her breath hitched at the way he said it. "But you were never going to tell me, were you?" His eyes met hers, dark and unreadable, but filled with something raw, something dangerously close to regret. He closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again, his voice quieter now. "I was afraid you'd look at me like you are right now." Her throat tightened. "Like what?" "Like you don't know me anymore." The words slammed into her chest with brutal force, because wasn't that exactly what she was feeling? She wanted to believe in him, in the man who had made her feel cherished, in the man who had held her like she was something precious. But how could she ignore what she had just heard? How could she pretend this didn't change things? A war raged inside her. Logic told her to walk away. Logic told her that this wasn't safe, that a man who hid such secrets wasn't someone she could trust. But her heart whispered something else entirely. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "I need time." Alexander's face hardened slightly, but there was no anger in his expression, only desperation. "Celeste, please." She shook her head, stepping back again. I need to think." And before she could break down right there in front of him, before she could let her emotions betray her, she turned and walked away. Alexander didn't stop her, but the way his gaze burned into her back as she left told her one thing. He wasn't about to let her go so easily. Celeste sat curled up on the worn-out couch in her small apartment, her fingers wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. The room was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the city outside, but inside her mind there was nothing but chaos. Hours had passed since she had walked away from Alexander, but it didn't feel like enough time. It didn't feel like she had any answers. She could still hear his voice, still see the way his expression had shattered when she told him she needed to think. "I was afraid you'd look at me like you are right now." The words played on repeat in her head, clawing at her heart. She had seen something in his eyes tonight that she hadn't seen before, something raw, something that made her question everything. This wasn't just about what he had done in the past. It wasn't even about Tristan's accusations. It was about trust, about the fragile, aching thing growing between them, about whether or not it could survive the weight of his past. She let out a slow, shaky breath, staring into the dark liquid in her cup. The warmth seeped into her palms, but it did nothing to thaw the cold inside her chest. She had felt something real with him, something she had never thought she would experience. But was it all just an illusion? A sharp knock at her door made her jump, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment she didn't move. She didn't need to guess who it was. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs as she slowly set her cup down, her fingers numb. Every part of her told her to ignore it, to let it pass, to not let him pull her back in before she could even make sense of her emotions. But another part, one that she hated, one that was still so desperately tied to him, made her rise to her feet. She hesitated for only a second before reaching for the door, and when she opened it, her breath hitched. There he was. Alexander stood in the dimly lit hallway, his usual composure gone. His suit was slightly disheveled, his tie loosened, as if he had been running his hands through his hair over and over again. There were shadows under his eyes, the faintest trace of exhaustion pulling at the edges of his features. But more than anything, it was his expression that stopped her heart. His eyes, full of anguish, full of her, locked onto hers, and in that instant Celeste felt her resolve slip just a little. "Celeste," he breathed, his voice hoarse, ragged, "I can't let you go." Her fingers gripped the doorframe, fighting to stay strong, even as her heart waged war against her mind. "Alexander, I know I should have told you the truth." His voice was raw, desperate. "I should have told you everything from the beginning, but I didn't know how. I was afraid." He exhaled sharply, his shoulders tense. "Not of what I did in the past, but of losing you." Celeste swallowed hard. God, why did he have to sound so broken? Her voice was barely a whisper. "And what if I can't look past it?" A flicker of pain crossed his face, but he didn't back away. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them, until his presence wrapped around her like a drug she had tried to quit but couldn't. His scent, warm spice and something undeniably him, filled her lungs, making it even harder to think. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I'm a man worthy of your love." His fingers brushed against hers, hesitant yet desperate. "I don't care how long it takes. Just don't shut me out." Tears burned at the edges of her vision. This wasn't the ruthless CEO the world saw. This wasn't the Alexander Knight that the media painted as untouchable, unstoppable. This was him, the man who had held her in the dark when nightmares kept her awake, the man who kissed her like she was his world, the man who had looked at her like she was the one thing he had never expected to want, yet couldn't live without. But was love enough? She shook her head, a tear slipping free before she could stop it. "I don't know if I can just pretend this didn't shake me." Alexander let out a shaky breath, his hands fisting at his sides. And then, before she could even register what was happening, he did something that shattered her completely. He dropped to his knees before her. Celeste gasped. "Alexander, what are you doing?" He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw everything in his eyes, the vulnerability, the pain, The love, every single wall he had ever built was gone, leaving him bare before her. "I've never begged for anything in my life," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Not for deals, not for power, not for money." His jaw clenched before he looked straight into her soul, his hands resting on his thighs. "But I'll beg for you, Celeste." Her chest tightened painfully, and her hands trembled. "Let me prove to you that I can be the man you deserve," he whispered. His voice cracked, just slightly, and it was that crack, the smallest break in his control, that undid her. "Because you're the only thing that makes me want to be better." Celeste sucked in a sharp breath, her heart shattering and piecing itself back together all at once. She had never expected this. She had never thought she would see Alexander Knight, a man feared by so many, a man untouchable in the corporate world, on his knees, pleading for her. But he was. And looking into his eyes, she knew. He meant every word. She had spent so much of her life being cautious, protecting herself from heartbreak, keeping her walls up so she wouldn't be left shattered. But with Alexander, she had already broken so many of her own rules. He had made her feel things she had sworn she never would. He had gotten inside her heart, and maybe, just maybe, she wasn't ready to give up on them either. She took a shaky breath, her fingers curling into fists before she finally reached for his hands. His grip tightened over hers instantly, as if he had been waiting for it, as if he had been praying for it. A flicker of hope, pure, desperate, real, lit up in his stormy eyes. Her voice wavered, but she didn't look away. "Then prove it, Alexander." For a long second, he just stared at her as if memorizing the moment, as if locking it away in the deepest part of him. And then, with more conviction than she had ever heard from him before, he whispered, "I will." And for the first time that night, Celeste let herself believe. The city lights shimmered in the distance, a breathtaking view stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls of Alexander's penthouse. The skyline was a canvas of golden hues and flickering stars, and yet Celeste found herself lost in her own thoughts as she stood by the balcony, the cool evening breeze whispering against her skin. So much had changed in just 1 week. 7 days since she had told Alexander to prove himself. 7 days since she had walked away, unsure of whether their love could withstand the weight of his past. And in those 7 days, Alexander had done just that, and more. He hadn't overwhelmed her with grand gestures or extravagant gifts, the way most billionaires would have tried to buy their way back into someone's heart. Instead, he had shown up, every single day. He had taken her to places that held meaning for him, places that had shaped him into the man he was today. He had shared memories, pieces of his past that no one, not even the world that worshipped his name, had ever been privy to. He had listened, truly listened to her fears, her doubts, her hopes. He had let her in, and little by little, Celeste had felt herself falling all over again. But tonight felt different. Tonight, when Alexander had called her, there had been something unspoken in his voice, something raw, something final. Now, as she turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, her pulse quickened. Alexander stood in the doorway, his gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that sent her heart racing. He looked powerful, commanding, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that undid her, a silent plea. "You came," he murmured, as if he had truly been afraid she wouldn't. Celeste offered a small smile, her chest tightening at the emotion in his voice. "Of course." He let out a slow exhale, as if he had been holding his breath all this time, waiting. Then, without another word, he stepped closer, reaching for her hand and lacing their fingers together. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. "I have something to show you," he said softly. Curious, she allowed him to lead her through the penthouse. She had been here before, But tonight, it felt different. There was an anticipation in the air, a quiet sense of inevitability that made her pulse quicken. He led her past the grand living space, past the marble floors and towering bookshelves, until they stopped in front of a quiet room she had never entered before. The moment she stepped inside, her eyes landed on the mahogany desk in the center. Stacked neatly on top were several sheets of paper. Her brows furrowed as she walked forward, reaching for them. The moment she scanned the contents, her breath caught in her throat. Legal documents. Her heart pounded as her gaze darted over the words, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. She looked up sharply, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alexander, this is your company." He nodded once, his expression unreadable. "I've started transferring ownership," he said quietly. Celeste's lips parted in shock. "What?" His eyes held hers, unwavering. "I told you I'd prove I wasn't the man I used to be, and I meant it." Tears stung her eyes as she looked back at the papers in disbelief. This wasn't just a gesture. This wasn't just an attempt to appease her. This was everything. "But this is your life's work," she whispered. "You built this empire from the ground up." His gaze softened as he took a step closer, his hands finding her face, his thumbs gently brushing against her cheeks. "No, Celeste," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You're everything to me." A soft sob caught in her throat. "I don't need power," he continued, his touch impossibly tender. "I don't need control. I don't need the empire I built if it means losing the one thing that truly matters." His fingers slid into her hair, cradling her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I just need you." Celeste felt her heart crack open, warmth flooding her chest in a way she had never experienced before. This man, this ruthless, feared, untouchable man, had stripped himself of everything for her. He had torn down the walls he had spent years building, not because she had asked him to, but because he wanted to. Because he wanted to be worthy of her. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she let out a shaky breath. "You really love me, don't you?" His expression softened, and in that moment he looked at her like she was his entire world. "With every part of me," he whispered, and just like that she knew. There was no more hesitation, no more doubt, no more fear. She loved him desperately, completely, irrevocably. With a soft gasp, Celeste threw her arms around his neck, pulling him down into a kiss that stole the air from her lungs. Alexander groaned against her lips, his arms wrapping around her, holding her impossibly close. The kiss was deep, passionate, a collision of love and desperation, of two souls that had found their way back to each other despite everything. His hands roamed her back, memorizing every inch of her, as if he would never get enough. As their lips parted, their foreheads pressed together, their breaths mingling. "Stay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Celeste smiled through her tears, her hands cradling his face. "Forever." A deep, relieved exhale left his lips before he kissed her again, this time slower, softer, filled with the promise of forever. And as Alexander lifted her into his arms, carrying her towards the life they were about to build together, Celeste knew this love, this man, was something she would never let go of. Because sometimes love wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing each other, again and again. And she would choose him, always.